Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Truth About Psychiatry. This is episode number 11, or video number 11. And I realized in the last video that I started to talk about why psychiatrists are called shrinks. And I did a little research, and I mentioned that I didn't quite find the exact reason why. But I think I forgot to say what I discovered. So apparently, if I'm not mistaken, there the notion of a psychiatrist as a shrink was a derogatory term that came from, there's a tribe in the Amazon or the region of Ecuador, Peru, where there are headhunters who, when they capture their victims, they actually shrink their heads. And somehow that got connected in the 50s or 60s. Somehow that got connected with psychiatrists, and they were called shrinks because they shrink people's heads. Some other things that I read said that a psychiatrist is their job is to shrink the ego of their patients, and so that's why they're called shrinks. But there are others that were connecting it more to these headhunters in the Amazon who shrink heads, and apparently that's how they um, became labeled as shrinks. So it's kind of an um, interesting historical tidbit to maybe do some more research on. If you find out anything different, let me know, because I just think it's strange. Um, but that's just from the last video. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about um, psychiatry as slavery, and we've in the previous videos we've spoken about the myth of mental illness, the chemical imbalance hoax. We've talked about psychiatry as a pseudoscience. We've mentioned the history of psychiatry, and all of this kind of leads up to why a person like Bonnie Bristow or Thomas Szasz would consider herself or himself as an abolitionist. And what does that mean? Basically, that Szasz and Bristow and others advocate for the abolition of psychiatry, not just the criticism of psychiatry or attempts to reform it. Um, so, so, and Bristow is very explicit about being an abolitionist, but Szasz is even more so. In fact, he's written 2 entire books on the topic I'd like to introduce to you. One is called Liberation by Oppression, a comparative study of slavery and psychiatry. And another is Psychiatric Slavery. But there's mention of psychiatric slavery in many of Szasz's books, and these are just a couple where he writes most explicitly about why psychiatry is slavery, and why, like chattel slavery in the South, psychiatry ought to be abolished. But before we get into those books, I just wanted to start with a few quotations that are also on my blog, Psychiatric Survivors. And so while I was kind of researching about the history of psychiatry, I was also working on a master's degree in politics, and I was studying the philosopher, political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he had some interesting things to say about medicine that I think are applicable to psychiatry. Now, I'm perfectly aware of Rousseau's moral failings and his character defects, to put it lightly, but I think he is actually written quite accurately some things about psychiatry and medicine that might also be relevant to this time of the pandemic. So here are some things that he wrote in his book Emile, on education. So let's see here. A feeble body makes a feeble mind, hence the influence of physic, an art which does more harm to man than all the evils it professes to cure. I do not know what the doctors cure us of, but I know this: they infect us with very deadly diseases: cowardice, timidity, credulity, and the fear of death. What matter if they make the dead walk? We have no need of corpses. They fail to give us men, and it is men that we need. Another, medicine is all the fashion in these days, and very naturally. It is the amusement of the idle and unemployed, who do not know what to do with their time, and so spend it in taking care of themselves. If by ill luck they had happened to be born immortal, they would have been the most miserable of men. If a life they could not lose would be of no value to them. Such men must have doctors to threaten and flatter them, to give them the only pleasure they can enjoy, the pleasure of not being dead. So Rousseau was pretty hard on medicine and doctors, and his there were reasons for that in his life, and but there's so much of this that I think is relevant to psychiatry that I just want to share a few more. Let's see. So medicine, this lying art, invented rather for the ills of the mind than of the body, is useless to both alike. It does less to cure us of our diseases than to fill us with alarm. It does less to ward off death than to make us dread its approach. It exhausts life rather than prolongs it. Should it even prolong life, it would only be to the prejudice of the race, since it makes us set its precautions before society and our fears before our duties. It is the knowledge of danger that makes us afraid. This is a good one. Would you find a really brave man? Seek him where there are no doctors, where the results of disease are unknown, and where death is little thought of. By nature, a man bears pain bravely and dies in peace. It is the doctors with their rules, the philosophers with their precepts, the priests with their exhortations, who debase the heart and make us afraid to die. He has a lot of things on medicine in his book Emile, and also in his other writings. There's another. If common observation shows us that medicine neither increases health nor prolongs life, it follows that this useless art is worse than useless, since it wastes time, men, and things on what is pure loss. Not only must we deduct the time spent, not in using life, but preserving it, but if this time is spent in tormenting ourselves, it is worse than wasted. It is so much to the bad, and to reckon fairly, a corresponding share must be deducted from what remains to us. A man who lives 10 years for himself and others without help of doctors lives more for himself and others than one who spends 30 years as their victim. I have tried both, so I think I have a better right than most to draw my own conclusions. So those are some. That's some of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's commentary on medicine, which I think is applicable to psychiatry. Another thought. Emily Dickinson has a nice little poem that I'd like to read. It's called "Much Madness is Divinest Sense." Much madness is divinest sense. To a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. So Rousseau, Dickinson. What about Winston Churchill? What did Winston Churchill have to say about psychiatry? One thing that he said in 1942, or that he wrote, he wrote, quote, I'm sure it would be sensible to restrict as much as possible the work of these gentlemen, i.e., psychiatrists, who are capable of doing an immense amount of harm with what may very easily degenerate into charlatanry. The tightest hand should be kept over them, and they should not be allowed to quarter themselves in large numbers upon the fighting services at the public expense. There are no doubt easily recognizable cases which may benefit from treatment of this kind, but it is wrong to disturb large numbers of healthy, normal men and women by asking the kind of odd questions in which the psychiatrists specialize. There are quite enough hangers-on and camp followers already. So, I don't agree with everything that Churchill says here. But he is right that they do immense amount of harm, and the tightest hand should be kept over them. Or as we'll see going forward, that not only a tight hand, but psychiatry, like slavery, ought to be abolished. So that's Churchill on psychiatry. Here's a thought from Frederick Douglass, one of my favorite authors and a great man, with a comment on tyranny that is applicable to psychiatry. Quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Men might not get all they work for in this world, but they must certainly work for all they get. If we ever get free from the oppressions and wrongs heaped upon us, we must pay for their removal. We must do this by labor, by suffering, by sacrifice, and if needs be, by our lives and the lives of others." So I love that. Frederick Douglass is just such a mensch, just a lover of liberty, and just he knew what it meant to not get all that you work for, but working for all that he got. And it's true with the same with psychiatry. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Never did and it never will. It also reminds me of what's going on in this pandemic. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. So it's kind of how tyranny works. Until people are willing to push back and resist, the tyranny will encroach further and further. And it makes the tyrant's job much easier when citizens just willingly or complacently give away their liberties. So that's something we can learn from Frederick Douglass. So now let's get into Thomas Szasz and his Thomas Szasz and his books Liberation by Oppression and Psychiatric Slavery. So as I was pondering what Szasz has written in these books, I realize there's a lot of controversial material in them, and I also realize that Szasz has been mainly ignored or dismissed. He's been ridiculed, he's been accused of being a Scientologist, and all other such nonsense. And it just occurred to me that what Szasz was doing, he was genuinely fighting for the abolition of a modern form of slavery. But the difference between Szasz Obviously, there are differences between chattel slavery and modern psychiatric slavery, and Szasz is careful to point those out. But there are also many similarities. And as I was thinking about Szasz and his work, it occurred to me that there often people who tell the truth um, are ridiculed or rejected or ignored. Um, I immediately thought of Christ in chapter 4 of Luke when he was given the book of Isaiah, and he opened the book and he read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And he closed the book, and he gave it to the minister, and sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, "This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears." So obviously, when Christ said that, the people were enraged. They wondered at the gracious words. They said, "Is this Joseph's son?" Um, and I like what he said next. And he said unto them, "You will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whatsoever we have heard and done in Capernaum, do also here in this country." And he said, "Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country." Now, I'm not saying that Szasz was a prophet, but he definitely had in mind something that was contributed, I believe, to what the Lord's work here was and is, that he said he is sent to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and to set at liberty them that are bruised. So especially those last two parts, deliverance to the captives and liberty to them that are bruised. And as Szasz understood, a lot of captives and bruised are there locked away in the prisons of psychiatry. Another thought came to me was there in the Book of Mormon. So we have one example in the Bible. In the Book of Mormon, there's a man named Abinadi, and he told the truth to a wicked king and his priests, and they were ready to kill him for telling the truth. And he said to them, this is in Mosiah chapter 13, "Touch me not, for God shall smite you if you lay your hands upon me. For I have not yet delivered the message which the Lord sent me to deliver, neither have I told you that which ye requested that I should tell. Therefore God will not suffer that I shall be destroyed at this time. But I must fulfill the commandments wherewith God has commanded me. And because I have told you the truth, ye are angry with me. And again, because I have spoken the word of God, ye have judged me that I am mad." So it's interesting. I just thought of reading this, that here's a man who is telling the plain truth to people, and just like the Savior, who spoke the truth always, the Savior was judged as mad. And here's Abinadi telling the truth, and he was judged as mad. So I wouldn't be surprised that, Thomas Szasz or anyone who speaks the truth about psychiatry would also be judged as mad by the pseudo-scientific profession, or the so-called profession of psychiatry that specializes in, judging people as mad. So those are a few thoughts on liberation from oppression, and just leading into our discussion of psychiatric slavery. So let's start with Szasz's book, Liberation by Oppression. Szasz likes to do a lot of wordplay. This is a comparative study of slavery and psychiatry. So I'm just going to read a bit of my blog post on this. You can look this up in psychiatricsurvivors.wordpress.com under the title Liberation by Oppression, A Comparative Study of Slavery and Psychiatry. Again, here's the book. Great book. When I discovered it, I just thought, this is it. This is the best book that Szasz has written. But as always with Szasz, I read another and I find out he had much more to say, and just a lot of depth, a lot of courage. So yeah, and when I read it, I thought this might be one of his best books. Quote, comparing psychiatry with slavery, Szasz writes in his preface, implying that they are similar kinds of institutions in human relations may at first glance seem bizarre, even obscene. Psychiatry is good, slavery is evil, but it is not that simple. No, it is not that simple. In fact, as Szasz also notes in his preface, supporters of psychiatric slavery claim that they seek to liberate the mental patient from the shackles of his illness while doing precisely the opposite. Moreover, abolitionists during the Civil War enjoyed a measure of esteem, whereas abolitionists of psychiatric slavery are often shunned and ridiculed. Quote, unlike the numbers of people who supported the opponents of the Confederacy during the Civil War, Szasz observes, few support the opponents of psychiatric slavery. Is it really possible that psychiatry is an institution of oppression? Is it possible that psychiatry is in any way comparable to chattel slavery? Szasz explains that, quote, the human rights violations of chattel slavery, the Inquisition, National Socialism, and Communism have been well documented. My goal is to show that psychiatry, as the oppression of the patient by the psychiatrist, defined and justified as the patient's liberation from an illness that robs him of freedom and responsibility, belongs in the pantheon of man's inhumanity to man. And more than anyone that I've read, even Bonnie Burstow, Robert Whitaker, Peter Breggin, more than anyone that I've read, Szasz makes it clear that that psychiatry does belong in this pantheon of man's inhumanity to man. So obviously there are many differences between Nazism, communism, chattel slavery, and what else did he mention? The Inquisition. And yeah, Szasz has a lot of interesting comparisons with the Inquisition as well. He has a whole book called The Manufacture of Madness. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future, where he compares psychiatry to the Inquisition and witch hunts, and it's a really excellent book. But Szasz has located psychiatry in this pantheon of man's inhumanity to man, and there are obvious differences, but the thing that's important about Szasz is he's bringing to light this this problem that exists, that belongs in the pantheon, but most people aren't aware of it, or they haven't even considered it. So in the future, I believe once psychiatry has been abolished, I think Szasz will be revered for the work that he did, even though often he's been given the silent treatment, or, like I said, he's been ignored or ridiculed. The first comparison that Szasz makes between chattel slavery and psychiatry is that for centuries people believed that forcibly enslaving the Negro was good for the slave, and that, quote, forcibly treating the insane was good for the mental patient. In other words, coercion has often been justified as a form of benevolence. This book should be read in its entirety by every lover of liberty. And then I have some passages from the book that I'll read a few of them just as an introduction. There's so many good ones, and it's such a great book. Let's see. I'll just start with the first one. Psychiatric intolerance. Okay, quote, psychiatric intolerance is one of the pillars of the therapeutic state. Its trinity, psychiatric diagnosis, psychiatric treatment, and psychiatric incarceration, is a mask for justifying coercion as care. Rejecting psychiatric treatment and rejecting life, i.e. attempting suicide, are psychiatric heresies punishable by psychiatric incarceration and involuntary psychiatric treatment. Opposition to coercive psychiatric suicide to coercive psychiatric suicide prevention is reflexively dismissed as to lacking in compassion, as to being unworthy of consideration. So this is a point of a tricky point with Szasz, that he had some very different things to say about suicide. And like I've said in previous videos, he's a little bit too libertarian for my taste. Legalizing drugs and making suicide legal and things like that. But he is right that about certain things about opposition to coercive suicide prevention. Maybe it's at least thought-provoking that Szasz opposed coercive psychiatric suicide prevention because, well, he believed he had, I think, maybe a too radical idea of freedom. But there is a sense in which all of these so-called suicide prevention groups and movements, although they're obviously, all of them are well intended, because no one wants anyone to kill themselves. We don't, and we want to help people who are feeling that way. But what Szasz helps us to understand is how such groups are actually causing the very problem that they wish to remedy, and how it perpetuates. A lot of it is just like with anything in so-called mental health and mental illness, it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's causing the very problems that it's supposed to remedy. So here's another. Psychiatric slavery, that is confining individuals in madhouses, began in the 17th century, grew in the 18th century, and became an accepted social custom in the 19th century. For more than 40 years, this is Szasz again, I have maintained that psychiatric reforms are exercises in prettifying plantations. Slavery cannot be reformed. It can only be abolished. As long as the idea of mental illness connotes dangerousness and legitimizes psychiatric power exercised through preventative psychiatric detention, psychiatric slavery cannot be abolished. In short, I oppose psychiatric slavery because I believe it is inimical to individual liberty and responsibility, to the rule of law, and to the very existence of a free society. So Szasz, he had I like his concept of the human being as being free and responsible, and that those are two sides of the same coin. And he also supported the rule of law, and so he saw things that were inimical to individual liberty and responsibility, such as psychiatry. He saw those as a threat to liberty, and rightly so, both liberty and responsibility. So, like slavery, he thought psychiatry should be abolished. And for the record, so do I. Quote, however, most people see psychiatry not as enslavement to a destructive ideology, but as liberation from a dangerous illness. They accept the claims that psychiatry is a medical science and psychiatric interventions are scientifically valid medical treatments of real disease. They do not see that the lot of psychiatric slaves is as miserable as ever, partly because they do not want to see it, and partly because making diagnoses and prescribing medications makes psychiatrists look like real doctors, who are perceived as intrinsically benevolent. A study of patients' attitudes towards physicians reveals that mostly patients trust doctors. I think this is true of psychiatry too. A lot of, in general, most people who struggle or are suffering in any way, shape, or form, a natural propensity is to seek resolution of that suffering at the hands of a physician, at the hands of a psychiatrist, depending on what the particular struggle is. But as Szasz rightly points out, there's um, much reason to be skeptical that any sort of healing will result from the interaction between a psychiatrist and a patient. And in fact, as Szasz points out, the exact opposite is most often the case. Um, Quote, formerly mental patients were restrained physically without the pretense of treatment. Now they are restrained chemically, and this pharmacological restraint masquerades as treatment. Formerly, the madman incarcerated in the madhouse was perceived as an incompetent person with an incurable illness. Now he is perceived as a dangerous patient suffering from a treatable illness, but lacking insight into his condition and hence requiring treatment at his will, against his will. So this is another important point that Szasz makes very often in his writings. Is he argues against the insanity defense, which takes away responsibility of a person, and also against the what's called anosognosia, or lacking insight. So one of the tricks of psychiatry is first to label a person as with a fake disease as mentally ill, and then when that person protests, then to label that person with another disease, anosognosia, or lacking insight. So the mentally ill person just doesn't have insight uh, into his mental illness, which is absurd. But it's been a very effective trick, and it's worked on a lot of people. Um, Quote, overwhelming support for psychiatric slavery by public policy and public opinion alike deprives a critic of a forum for effective dissent, regardless of the absurdity of the claim he criticizes. Coercive psychiatric practices are now more common, affect more persons, and are believed to be better justified than they have ever been. Let's see. Okay, this is good. Quote, we have come a long way since the days when insanity was considered incurable. Considering insanity incurable has made the insane person's situation worse, not better. As long as the psychiatrists believed that insanity was incurable, that patients were, to some extent, protected from the psychiatrist's furor therapeuticus. Conversely, the more obsessed the psychiatrist becomes with his power to defeat mental illness, the more enraged he becomes by the patient's rejection of treatment. Thus, some of the worst abuses of psychiatry have been committed in the name of psychiatric treatment, such as insulin coma therapy, electric shock treatment, and lobotomy. Today, we can add psychotropic drugs to the list. So all those things that Szasz listed there, insulin coma therapy, electroshock treatment, and lobotomy, and psychotropic drugs, all of those, hopefully we can talk about these in more detail, because the history of psychiatry, each one of these, maybe we could call them milestones in psychiatry, even though they're not really milestones. We should talk about each of them, because the story behind each of them should come to light, because I mean, it's just awful how they were developed. Lobotomy, electroshock, and I'll hopefully be able to talk a little bit about the history behind some of those things in future videos. Let's see. Okay, so this is an important point. Quote, before concluding these introductory remarks, I want to acknowledge that the comparison of psychiatric slavery with chattel slavery fails in one important respect. From the earliest days of chattel slavery in America, many prominent members of the oppressor class felt a deep sense of guilt for the practice, which they recognized as a profound moral offense against the Negro slave, whose humanity was self-evident. The Declaration of Independence spelled the doom of chattel slavery. More specifically, the deeds and words of the first three American presidents signified the recognition among the leaders of the land that slavery was simply wrong. George Washington provided for the emancipation of his slaves in his will. John Adams rejected owning slaves and declared, quote, every measure of prudence ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery in the United States, unquote. Jefferson famously wrote, I tremble for my country when I think that God is just, and stated that, quote, it was among his first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country might be abolished by law. So, Declaration of Independence, first three presidents, they all recognized the profound moral offense that slavery was, whereas with psychiatric slavery, very few recognize what a terrible moral offense it is and why it needs to be abolished. And in that vein of abolishing psychiatric slavery, I was also reminded of, again, of who do we just quote earlier? Frederick Douglass. So he has a great speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," and where 4th of July is a time to celebrate freedom, liberty, all the blessings of the United States. When I read that speech, obviously Douglass was rebuking the United States for the sin of slavery, and when I read that speech, I thought how applicable that is today. Although there are obvious differences between chattel slavery and psychiatric slavery, I would think, what to the psychiatric slave is the 4th of July? You have people being involuntarily incarcerated, being drugged, being abused, being tortured, and often killed as a result of the drugging or other problems, and yet all of this passes under the guise of medicine. And all of this is happening right under our noses, right here in the United States. So what to the psychiatric slave is the 4th of July, I would say. Let's see. Share a few more passages from Liberation by Oppression. Quote, neither in the United States nor anywhere else in the world have a significant number of persons expressed interest in securing freedom from coerced psychiatric meddling. Quite the contrary, most Americans sincerely believe that expanding the scope of psychiatric slavery would benefit the country, just as most slaveholders early in the 1800s sincerely believed that expanding chattel slavery would benefit it. So I would disagree with Szasz there, because the difference is that the people who sincerely believed in expanding chattel slavery, they could only do so by ignoring the obvious moral wrong that slavery is, whereas in modern proponents of psychiatry often do so without a knowledge of the evil that it is. So, but as we've quoted C.S. Lewis before, that that the worst kind of tyranny is a tyranny exercised by those who do so with the approval of their own conscience. So it was for chattel slavery, for slaveholders, it took an exercise in denying their conscience and denying the moral wrong of slavery, whereas with modern psychiatric slavery, it's often perpetrated under the guise of medicine, under the guise of healing, and with the approval of the conscience of those who exercise this tyranny, which is one of the things that makes it that much more horrible, not just for the psychiatric slaves, but also for those who are perpetrating the crimes without knowing it. Let's see. Here's another comparison Szasz makes. Quote, much as slaveholders like to view themselves as rescuing the Negro from savagery, psychiatrists like to view themselves as rescuing the involuntary patient from insanity. So throughout this whole book, Szasz is making the comparison, and I think in many cases it's apt. But obviously, there's a difference here with rescuing the involuntary patient from insanity, because it's, instead of slavery based on race, it's slavery based on a fictitious disease. And again, I'll point out that the fictitious diseases, the fake so-called mental illness, all of these labels in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, even though they're all, inventions and fabrications, figments of the psychiatric imagination, that does not mean that people don't suffer or struggle with problems. It just means that the way that psychiatry has managed to manipulate those problems is reprehensible. Back to Szasz. Quote, chattel slavery was the original sin of the American ideal of individual liberty, a sin the nation has still been unable to fully expiate. Psychiatric slavery, I shall argue, is the Achilles heel of that ideal, a fatal flaw that may yet transform the American dream into an American nightmare. Quote, thus for me, the most obvious thing about mental hospitals has always been that they are very bad places. The persons locked up say they are bad, and to make matters worse, the persons who lock them up say they are good places, and that they are especially good for those who are locked up. So here's Szasz just relentlessly defending the victims of psychiatry against those who victimize them. I'll just keep reading here. Quote, by the time I was an adolescent, I concluded that people declared to be crazy are incarcerated because they embarrass their family, that removing them to insane asylums serves the interests of their relatives and other members of society, and most importantly, that inquiring into the justifications for locking up mad people is taboo. Crazy people belong in madhouses. Only a crazy person would ask why. So Szasz is already recognizing that people are going to call him crazy for speaking the truth. So he's already asking the very simple childlike question, why are they doing this? What is this? What is that? Why are they doing that? What's going on here? And he was a truth seeker. Let's see. Quote, well aware that asking such questions is taboo, an offense not only against psychiatry but also against conventional wisdom, I waited until I completed my psychiatric and psychoanalytic training before systematically addressing and challenging the practice of involuntary mental hospitalization. I was not surprised to discover in the 1950s, when I was gathering materials for what became the book The Myth of Mental Illness and the book Law, Liberty, and Psychiatry, that most psychiatric textbooks were silent on the subject of coercion. Psychiatrists pretended that mental patients are admitted to state mental hospitals the same way that medical patients are admitted to regular hospitals. So even as a youth, Szasz saw that psychiatry was bunk, but he still, as he went through medical school and went through the field of psychiatry, he got his credentials first so that he could work toward the abolition of psychiatry from the inside. And this is what Peter Breggin has done as well. It was a little different but Breggin also discovered when he was younger, and in his early career, he discovered the atrocities of psychiatry, and he's very bravely and courageously labored to expose those atrocities, as have others such as Whitaker and Burstow and others. Let's see. Quote, how are we to understand this history and this situation? The best way to do so is by seriously scrutinizing the power of the psychiatrist to imprison and the status of the mental patient as prisoner. In short, by taking seriously the similarities between slavery and psychiatry. So Szasz obviously took this seriously. He's written entire books on the topic. And I think we should take it seriously too and consider what the comparisons are and what the similarities are. We should also consider what the differences are. Um, and Szasz does so, but the reason he's drawing this comparison is not necessarily just to say that they're exactly the same, but just to say to reveal that psychiatry is a form of slavery, and the best way to explain that to people is to compare it to something that people already understand. People already understand that chattel slavery in the South was evil, that it needed to be abolished, and that the process of that abolition was a good thing. Um, but fewer people understand why the same is true about psychiatry and why that also needs to be abolished. And most likely it will take a long time since, you know, obviously chattel slavery took a long time. It wasn't abolished from one day to the next, even though the founders and clearly in the Declaration of Independence that was the death sentence for slavery, but it obviously took a long time for that to be um, put into effect. Quote, chattel slavery is one of the oldest institutions. Psychiatric slavery is one of the youngest. The basic element shared by both is the use of force by one person to make another do something against his will. As long as an oppressive practice is customary, it is by definition acceptable. It may even be viewed as altruistic. The coercer is perceived as caring for, educating, or treating the coerced. The master coerced, controlled, and cared for his family and his slaves. The psychiatrist is expected to, and legally authorized to, coerce, control, and care for his patients. Throughout most of history, people viewed slavery as a socially necessary institution, and this perception was shared by both masters and slaves. The same is now true for psychiatric slavery. So this is an interesting point. So a lot of people justified chattel slavery all throughout history as, this is a necessary institution. And obviously, the way that psychiatry and mental illness and mental health is talked about today, most people look at it as these are necessary institutions. But as Szasz helps us to see, they're actually not. Quote, no one contests that coercive police practices serve the interests of community, not the interests of the persons detained by the police. However, few concede that coercive psychiatric practices serve the interests of the community and not the interests of the person detained by psychiatrists. This denial legitimizes the consequences of psychiatry's two paradigmatic procedures, civil commitment and the insanity defense. So these are the two procedures of psychiatry that Szasz worked most against: civil commitment, or what is actually enslavement or involuntary incarceration, and the insanity offense. He has a whole book on that. People, what it does is it makes people guilty who are innocent, and then people who are innocent, it makes them guilty. So with the insanity defense, often people have committed terrible crimes and they're guilty, but they get let off the hook by psychiatry for pleading insanity. And Szasz was also relentless in showing why that's just psychiatric trickery. And there's all sorts of examples throughout history that Szasz writes about, and perhaps we'll talk about some of them in the future. Quote, psychiatrists have long had a veritable love affair with coercion as benevolence. The modern psychiatrist's love for using force to help patients knows no bounds. Clearly, having involuntary patients is useful for psychiatrists and many others as well. To be sure, psychiatric slaves are useful in a different way than were chattel slaves. So here's at least one difference that Szasz is pointing out: the difference of the utility of a psychiatric slave versus the utility of a chattel slave. For millennia, labor was scarce and mass poverty was the norm. Slave laborers were needed to produce goods and services. Slavery was feudalism writ large. Slaves laboring in the fields and the homes were producers of goods and services. Their social status, however, was that of dependence. They were the prototypical child workers. Today, in advanced societies, labor is plentiful and the state is croesus. Slave patients are needed to produce work and jobs for others. Psychiatric slavery is statism writ large. Psychiatric slavery is statism. Psychiatric slaves treated in hospitals, clinics, and the offices of mental health professionals are consumers of healthcare services. Their social status, however, is that of dependence. They are incompetent, insane, non-responsible. So here Szasz is arguing what's the utility of psychiatric slavery? What's the utility of labeling all these people as mentally ill, incarcerating them, drugging them? Like, what does that do? Well, all of this under the myth of mental illness, it allows for the flourishing of psychiatry, for the pharmaceutical industry, for the mental health professions. All of that is so instead of the slaves, laboring to produce food and goods for their slave owners, you have psychiatric slaves who are being drugged and coerced and abused so that in order to continually grow the therapeutic state. And this is a point that Robert Whitaker makes in his book. He makes it in all his books, Anatomy of an Epidemic, but Psychiatry Under the Influence. I mean, there's a vast amount of wealth that is produced for the profession of psychiatry, for the psychiatrists. I mean, I looked up one time, I think the average psychiatrist can make, at least on the occupational handbook website, it said a psychiatrist can make up to an average of $200,000 a year. So these guys are making a ton of money off of their slaves, the psychiatric slaves. And obviously think of all the other professions that are being maintained by this system of slavery. So abolishing psychiatry would be, it's a complex thing, and it will take, who knows what it'll take, but it's once the myth of mental illness is understood, or that's come to light and it's clear to the general public, some people see that the house of cards of psychiatry will just crumble, and along with it, once people understand the myth of mental illness and the fraudulence inherent in psychiatry, then think of all the supporting institutions that will crumble around it. Because without psychiatry, or without the myth of mental illness, there would be no psychiatry. Without the sacred symbol of schizophrenia, there would be no psychiatry. Without the fake diseases of bipolar, ADHD, all these fake diseases that are invented and compiled in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and along with the chemical imbalance hoax, once all that is clear, what good? Why would we need psychiatrists? Why would we need mental health workers? Those people, in a way, that's good for them too, because those people are also liberated to seek, dignified and purposeful employment instead of working as psychiatric slave owners or slave drivers, whether wittingly or not. I think most are doing it unwittingly. Clearly, having involuntary patients is useful. Okay, I just read that. Producers of goods. So those are the differences between psychiatric slavery and chattel slavery. Slavery and psychiatric treatment rest on coercion. Voluntary labor and medical treatment rest on cooperation. The psychiatrist slave owner views his patient as an individual deprived of moral agency by mental illness. The patient requires treatment against his will for his own benefit. The contractual medical doctor views his patient as a moral agent possessing the same rights and responsibilities as he does. Each is free from coercion by the other, and each is responsible for his own behavior. So Szasz likes to draw a distinction between actual medical practice and psychiatry, in that medical practice is consensual. You have equals, who a patient who consents to treatment based on an equal relationship, or at least a more balanced relationship between a doctor and a patient. Whereas in psychiatry, it's this is the everything rests on coercion. So Szasz does argue in some of his books that there is a form of psychiatry that's non-coercive or consensual, and he writes about this in some of his works on psychotherapy. And in a sense, I mean, I can agree to a certain extent that, if people want to talk to people about their problems and find help, like, wonderful. And if they want to pay other people to do that, more power to you. But I think Szasz didn't quite understand. He understood a little bit about the problem of psychotropic drugs, and he understood a little bit about coercive psychiatry. But even the notion that there's a coercive psychiatry and a non-coercive psychiatry, I think muddies the waters a little bit. It's a little, I think it weakens his thesis a little bit, because in reality, psychiatry is by its very nature coercive. It was founded that way, and Szasz even writes about this. It was founded on coercion, promoted by coercion, and exists by coercion still. So his argument that there's a contractual kind of psychiatry, I think, is kind of weakens his argument a little bit. Herein lies the fundamental similarity between the slave and the involuntary mental patient. Both reject the care imposed on them by their self-appointed benefactors. Oh, this is a good one. Quote, everyone wants to believe that one's own behavior is morally praiseworthy, especially if the individual profits from it economically and existentially. Thus, persons whose work depends on the routine use of coercion, for example, policemen, judges, Internal Revenue Service agents, believe that the force they exercise is justified because it is necessary and beneficial for society. Appropriately, the law calls this principle police power. So you can see a lot of Szasz's libertarianism coming out in passages like that, which, to a certain extent is okay. Quote, psychiatric historians and psychiatric practitioners deny the ongoing psychiatric holocaust. Journalists and the public, fearing to appear ignorant of the widely celebrated scientific advances in psychiatry, do not challenge its diagnoses allegedly based on brain scans, and its claims for cures attributed to neuropsychopharmacological miracle drugs. How are we to explain this? Understanding the concept of legal fiction, and specifically its use to legitimize chattel slavery in the past and psychiatric slavery now, goes a long way toward answering that question. There's a lot in there. I like the beginning. Psychiatric historians, one of whom is Edward Shorter, psychiatric practitioners deny the ongoing psychiatric holocaust. But as Szasz and others have showed, it's really going on, and there's all sorts of ways that psychiatrists or proponents of psychiatry try to get around it. Quote, everyone who makes use of mental health laws and practices, perhaps most importantly the relatives of mental patients, needs the fiction of mental illness with its implications of disease, dangerousness, and incompetence to help him perceive responsible adults as if they were helpless infants. I like that, because that's often what happens, is people get labeled, And even the people themselves who are labeled as quote unquote mentally ill, it's not to say that a person doesn't suffer or struggle with any sort of problem. What it means is that once they've been labeled as such, even that person and um, often the family members can see that person as a mentally ill person, therefore, as if they were helpless infants. I see this happening with, we talked about the myth of autism, how that happens with autism, and how these labels change your perception of a human being. I've talked about a human being as, created in the image of God, having dignity, moral agency, the ability to grow in wisdom and knowledge. These are all dignified ways of seeing other human beings as moral agents, as free persons. Psychiatry just the deception of psychiatry is to eliminate that and to cause people to see others as, helpless infants, as, mentally ill, or this or that. I had a thought come to me that I wanted to share about that. Let's see. The dangerousness and incompetence. So this is something that Szasz also writes frequently about, is oftentimes the quote unquote the supposedly mentally ill are viewed as dangerous to themselves and others. And as Szasz and Bregan Whitaker and others have amply pointed out, is just plain false. Um, the danger is in psychiatry itself. The vast majority of people who are labeled as mentally ill pose no threat to themselves or others. They are much less dangerous than psychiatrists themselves, and the times where the dangers that can occur are when psychiatry meddles with these innocent people, and through their chemical lobotomies can, as Peter Bregan has shown in his book Medication Madness, and I've talked about with various celebrities, and famous cases of mass shootings, and like the plane crash with Andrea Lubitz. Those are all dangerous cases, but people that they're not mentally ill. But that's usually what happens is once these, you remember Columbine, you remember all these, terrible shootings. Most of these people, or a lot of them, were on psychotropic drugs. And it's not to say that some of them weren't already violent. It's just that Bregan has shown that these drugs can actually turn the mildest and most peaceful, loving soul into, a person who goes on a rampage. So, and again, that's not because the person is in any way mentally ill. It's because the toxic chemicals that have been forced upon that person often may cause him or her to do things that he or she wouldn't normally do. So that was a little aside about the lie about the mentally ill being dangerous to themselves or others. So maybe it's a good point to say also, to remind you, never, if you're on psychotropic drugs, or if you know someone is on psychotropic drugs, never withdraw from them rapidly. Don't ever go off them cold turkey, because that can also, not just going on the drugs, but also going off of them rapidly can, I've given the metaphor, it's like shaking up a bottle with a cap on it and just pulling the cap off really quickly. That can cause a person to do crazy things that he or she wouldn't normally do, and that's also a reason why some people repeatedly end up in the hospital, or the hospital in the psychiatric prison. So don't do that. Don't withdraw rapidly. Okay, this is good. Quote, before slavery could be abolished, its rationalizations based on scripture, genetics, and paternalism had to be undermined. Abolitionists accomplished that goal. Similarly, before psychiatric slavery can be abolished, its rationalizations based on disease, dangerousness, and treatment, and most importantly, protecting the individual from himself, have to be undermined. Like the abolition of chattel slavery, the abolition of psychiatric slavery must be a collective effort. For now, psychiatric slavery is indispensable for the functioning of American society. So I think Szasz is right. There are a lot of abolitionists, a lot of people talking about abolishing psychiatry, others who are talking about reforming it. But all of this talk will do nothing until people understand the underlying fraudulence of psychiatry from its inception, and the fraudulence of the myth, how the myth of mental illness was created, how the chemical imbalance hoax was created. Once those facts about psychiatry come to light and are widely understood, that will do more than any tinkering with the mechanics that are already in place. Quote, it is only because psychiatry is allied with the state that deviance from psychiatric norms is defined as disease, and psychiatrists have the power to coerce mental patients. If psychiatry and the state were separated, deviance from psychiatric norms would cease to be considered diseases, and psychiatrists would lose their power to coerce persons who disagree with them. So that's an interesting point, and a lot of other abolitionists and critics of psychiatry are trying to disconnect psychiatry from the power of the state, because Szasz talks about it as the therapeutic state, and I think that is an important thing to do. I'll have to give that more thought, though, because I'm not quite sure that merely separating psychiatry from the state will really, that's part of what needs to be done, but that's only part of it. Overtly and nominally, psychiatrists are physicians, medical specialists. Their medical identity is well recognized and not disputed. Covertly and actually, they are judges and jailers. Their identity as agents of the judicial and penal systems is not well recognized, and is often disputed and even denied. However, it does not require a semantic autopsy on the word dangerous to recognize that by so qualifying a person, we stigmatize and cast him out of society. We regularly use the adjective dangerous in lieu of the injunction avoid, as in calling certain drugs or high-tension wires dangerous. Let's see here. There's just so many good quotes here about psychiatric slaves as being useful dependents. How do psychiatrists acquire psychiatric slaves? Oh, this is good. How do psychiatrists acquire psychiatric slaves? The oldest method of psychiatric slave catching consists of creating a special class of persons, originally called the mad or the insane, now called the mentally ill or mentally ill and dangerous, a special class of doctors originally called mad doctors and alienists, now called psychiatrists, a special class of quasi-prisons originally called madhouses or insane asylums, now called mental hospitals, and a special class of laws called mental health laws that authorize psychiatrists to forcibly confine mental patients in mental hospitals. This method of catching slaves has been used for 300 years and is still the basic tool of the slave catcher. And this is another obvious difference from chattel slavery in the South, you know, capturing, um, imprisoning slaves from Africa or in other times and other forms of slavery of capturing slaves. The way that psychiatry captures slaves, there are so many. I mean, just so many ways that they do it, um, and some of them are really really clever. Um, so, and some of them are clever enough to, you know, you don't have to forcibly capture the slave if the slaves just willingly, um, you know, admit themselves as slaves, which I think this is something to pay attention to in our in this coronavirus or Wuhan virus, this pandemic, in connection with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was different from 1984. George Orwell's 1984 is the more masculine tyranny of a boot on the face, and we're going to coerce you, and Big Brother's going to force you to do these things. We're going to throw things down the memory hole, and you're going to learn to love Big Brother by force and coercion. Well, Aldous Huxley, his brilliant allegory in Brave New World is that the people, they will, you don't need to do that, because the new tyranny, the people will just, they will learn to embrace and love their slavery. And maybe we'll talk about that in future, because I have a blog post on that about, because in Brave New World there's, Huxley writes about the drug soma, and that reminds me a lot of what psychiatry does. Is it you know it sedates people. It puts them on drugs so that they think that they're taking medicine, but it's actually, robbing them of their liberties without them knowing it. So how did I get off on that? Catching slaves. How does psychiatry catch slaves? I mean, just think of it. Think of the National Institute of Mental Health, NIM. Think of SAMHSA is another, NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. There's all of these institutions. Think of the federal government. Think of state governments. Think of all the things you see in the news about mental illness this, mental illness that. Oh, anxiety this, depression that. And it's just marketing this whole way of thinking that is drawing, people, a lot of innocent people, it's drawing them into the net. Because a person who is a human being, you're a human being, you're going to go through hard things in life. And those are, that's part of life. And often when people are going through those hard things, whether they're feeling low, whether they're having anxiety or whatever it might be, they're going to be looking for solutions. And lo and behold, here's this whole apparatus that's set up. It's like, here's the Venus flytrap, and here's all these poor flies out here, and it's just, it's a very effective system of slave catching, and it's working quite well, which is why I appreciate the work that Szasz has done, and I hope that more people will recognize the evil that it is, and that people will, having this information, people will be able to make decisions for themselves about how to deal with their problems. Let's see. Okay, Szasz mentions I've talked about this before, the drapetomania. Some slaves in the South were diagnosed with drapetomania, which was the disease that made them want to escape. Another one he mentions is dysaesthesia aethiopis. So drapetomania was defined as this disease causing slaves to run away, while dysaesthesia aethiopis was said to be a habitude of mind peculiar to Negroes. So, obviously, and these are kind of the forerunners of psychiatry of so nowadays you have something called there's even a fake disease called oppositional defiance disorder. So once you're being coerced and drugged and incarcerated and abused by psychiatrists, if you want to escape or if you want to get away, then they can label you as being with another disease called oppositional defiance disorder, which, it just reminds me a lot of these ridiculous invented diseases. Okay, here's something Szasz even mentions Frederick Douglass. Quote, "This is not all. Anticipating psychiatric abuses by a century, abolitionism itself was sometimes dismissed as madness, and the most famous American abolitionists had to reject the imposition of an insanity defense. John Brown's attorneys tried to prevent his being sentenced to the gallows by entering a plea of insanity, but Brown was incensed at the idea and announced that he was as sane as they were. Frederick Douglass aptly offered this eulogy for Brown. Mine was as the taper light, his was as the burning sun. I could live for the slave, John Brown could die for him." These early attempts to demean the Negro slave and the white's abolitionist passion for liberty as symptoms of mental illness foreshadowed the frightening similarities between the dying system of chattel slavery and the developing system of psychiatric slavery. Quote, "Modern psychiatry rests on the false premise that mental illnesses are brain diseases treatable with drugs. Political correctness requires that we accept this premise and the practices it entails as the products of modern neuroscience and the procedures of humane social control. As science, this is bunk because it confuses personal conduct with biological condition. As social control, it is despotism, subjecting innocent individuals to incarceration." Chattel slavery rested on the denial that the Negro was a person. Psychiatric slavery rests on the denial that the person with a psychiatric diagnosis is a person with the ability and right to make decisions about his own life. To this, the doctrine of psychiatric slavery adds the lie that psychiatric imprisonment is hospitalization. The result is that the psychiatrists systematically misdefine public psychiatry and misdescribe its true aim. In the case of mental health laws, the opposite principle prevails, forcing drugs down a patient's throat or injecting them into his buttocks. It is exalted as sacred therapeutic duty. So, yeah, Szasz is so clear about this, that all these atrocities that psychiatry perpetrates are they masquerade as medicine. They are presented as part of, this is the duty and the healing art of psychiatry. Psychiatry's clarion call for treatment with medications has been generally well received by the American public. Many people like to take drugs and like to be dominated by authorities they regard as benevolent. Yeah, and that's an unfortunate thing that we talked about medication spellbinding. Peter Breggin showed how a lot of times people that take these drugs, they think that they're getting better because the drugs are they're affecting the mind in a way that, it's like any drug. Like a person who's intoxicated with alcohol may feel better for a while, and that's what Breggin calls medication spellbinding, is the effect of people thinking that they're improving and getting better when actually the drug is gradually deteriorating their brain. So, yeah. Here's a good one. Quote, "The free society, as this idea is understood among political philosophers, rests on the principles that the citizen is a responsible adult possessing individual rights and owing duties to the community. In contrast, psychiatry, as a system of social practices, rests on the principle that the citizen is a potential mental patient who is, or might at any moment be, like an infant requiring care and control. Thus, the rule of law and the rule of psychiatric care are mutually incompatible. The more we have of one, the less we have of the other. And this reminded me of a quote by Edmund Burke. He talked about basically our liberty depends on our ability to put chains on our moral appetites, and the less we have of that internal, or what we might call self-mastery or self-control, the less of that there is internally, the more of it will be imposed externally. So, and that, I mean, that's psychiatry in a nutshell, is the external imposition of force and restraint. Even though psychiatry can do that to all sorts of people, a lot of abolitionists, a lot of anti-psychiatrists like to talk about how psychiatry is particularly harmful to minorities or to women, and there is some truth to that. But in reality, psychiatry, it's really a trap, a wide open trap for everyone. It will take in whatever, even the most competent individuals. It can draw them into the net. Some stuff on insulin treatment, therapy, so-called therapy, stigmatization. This is good. The true motive for the use of psychiatric force is not protection from dangerousness, but the desire to get rid of unwanted persons, especially family members. So this is a sad part of the history of psychiatry, is that, often, there would be even spouses who, husbands who would put away their wives into asylums, by labeling them as hysterics, having hysteria, back in the day of Freud and Charcot, or people giving their family members lobotomies. I think Szasz even writes about this, and there's some famous cases. I believe there was, in the Kennedy family, I think it was Rose, I think her name was Rose Kennedy, was, I think, a victim of this practice. Let's see here. There's just so much in this book. Obviously, I'd recommend that you could read it yourself. Let's just see if there's any more juicy tidbits here. Quote, "The psychiatrist's hypocrisy, like the hypocrisy of the slave owner before him, is plain to all who use their eyes for seeing and their minds for thinking." I like Szasz. Szasz he's a pretty bold abolitionist, and I like how forthright he is about his position. "I hold psychiatrists responsible for their crimes against humanity, their willful ignorance fueled by their bad faith." So that's pretty hard. I mean, for the most part, I think it's true. Although, as I mentioned before, I think there are a lot of good people, you might say good apples in a rotten barrel, good people who are dragged into this or somehow get into this field, and most are probably doing it without knowing it. But, this Szasz and these other anti-psychiatrists and abolitionists can help not just as I mentioned, they can help not just the victims of psychiatry, but they can help psychiatrists themselves to actually learn the truth about psychiatry. Because it's not taught, obviously. If these things were taught in medical school, then no one would ever become a psychiatrist. except as Thomas Szasz did in order to work toward the abolition of psychiatry. More about comparing chattel slavery to psychiatric slavery. Let's see. Oh, this is an interesting note. In 1971, George Alexander, professor of law at Santa Clara University, Irving Goffman, and I founded the American Association for the Abolition of Involuntary Mental Hospitalization. Our aim was to give voice to psychiatric abolitionists from all walks of life and assist psychiatric slaves to regain their freedom. 9 years later, realizing that our small group lacking access to funds in the media was not up to this task, we abandoned the effort. Professional and popular opinion were running in the opposite direction. The forces of therapeutic jurisprudence had won the hearts and minds of America's leading opinion makers and of the American people. So Szasz was fighting an uphill battle. It's even more so today. He says professional and popular opinion were running the opposite direction. I mean, that's still the case today, but that's one reason why I think Szasz needs to be resurrected in a sense, or his writings need to be more widely disseminated, and people need to be alerted to these ideas, these arguments from Szasz. Quote, the glorification of chattel slavery on the eve of the Civil War was no doubt useful for blinding the slaveholders to the brutalities of slavery, but it inflamed the abolitionists. The glorification of psychiatric slavery today has had a similar effect on me. I end this chapter with a brief review of the theory and practice of psychiatric brutalities as described by their proud practitioners. I close with words I borrow from the immortal pen of Samuel Johnson. I have protracted my work, he wrote in the preface to his dictionary, till most of those whom I wish to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss it with frigid tranquility, having little to fear or hope from censure or from praise. So I think at a certain point, Szasz realized that people weren't listening, they weren't going to understand, and he was, after decades of, and dozens and dozens of books, he realized that he was probably writing for future generations, and that might be the case even now, because as I've noticed the reception, although there are some people catching on to what Whitaker and Bregan and Burstow and others have written, it seems like a very slow process, and very, especially whatever you read in the media, the news. So, unfortunately, a lot of these people, it might be just, no longer writing for the present, but for future generations. So that's an introduction to liberation by oppression. There's a lot more in there, comparing modern psychiatry to slavery. As I mentioned, Thomas Szasz has another book with the title Psychiatric Slavery. Just briefly, I'll introduce this book. If slavery were being practiced today, would you oppose it? If innocent people were being involuntarily incarcerated, tortured, abused, drugged, and enslaved, would you object? Most of us, I believe, would answer yes to both of these hypothetical rhetorical questions. But what if I were to restate the question more directly? Slavery is being practiced today. Do you oppose it? Innocent people are being involuntarily incarcerated, tortured, abused, drugged, and enslaved. Do you object? To these questions, I would add another. What will you do to abolish this modern form of slavery once you discover the fact that it is being practiced today in the name of psychiatry and under the guise of medicine? In his book Psychiatric Slavery, Dr. Thomas Szasz boldly argues that modern psychiatry is in many ways comparable to the chattel slavery that was once practiced on plantations in the southern United States. The claim may sound extreme to those who are not familiar with the history of psychiatry. Nevertheless, the evidence that Szasz musters in support of this thesis is sufficient to challenge even the most ardent proponents of psychiatry. Furthermore, Szasz's book, Psychiatric Slavery, promotes the abolition of psychiatric slavery in such a way as to leave little doubt as to whose side justice is on. Toward the end of his book, Szasz notes that psychiatric slavery, although under attack, continues to flourish. Szasz is careful to admit that chattel slavery and psychiatric slavery are not identical in every way. Nevertheless, he contends that the ideological, economic, political, linguistic, and legal similarities between involuntary servitude and involuntary psychiatry are so commanding that we ignore them at our own peril. If that peril was great when Szasz first published Psychiatric Slavery in 1977, it is even more so today. Szasz makes the comparison between chattel slavery and psychiatric slavery most explicit in the final chapter of Psychiatric Slavery, but the preceding chapters lay the groundwork for understanding how and why psychiatry operates as a modern form of slavery. Szasz develops his thesis through a detailed analysis of the case of the psychiatric slave Kenneth Donaldson in connection with the psychiatrist J.B. O'Connor, the American Psychiatric Association, and the Supreme Court. With compelling precision, Szasz demonstrates how modern psychiatry joins forces with the American judicial system and what he refers to as the therapeutic state to subjugate and enslave innocent citizens in a manner that is reminiscent of antebellum Southern plantations. In the preface to Psychiatric Slavery, Szasz notes that, quote, people throughout the world condone psychiatric slavery as just and humane, and he explains reasons for employing the phrase psychiatric slavery. Quote, why do I use the phrase psychiatric slavery in the title? I admit that its shock value was an attraction. However, my main reason for choosing this title was that I consider the comparison between involuntary servitude and involuntary psychiatry enlightening and valid. Szasz cites Webster's definition of slavery, that is, quote, control by imposed authority, unquote, as a starting point for his comparison between chattel slavery and psychiatric slavery. Throughout Psychiatric Slavery, Szasz shows how, quote, the premise that psychiatric slavery is a socially indispensable institution undergirds all efforts at so-called psychiatric reform, and that with few exceptions, this perception is shared by mental health professionals and mental patients alike. The thrust of Szasz's argument in Psychiatric Slavery and in all of his books is that liberty and responsibility are two sides of the same coin, and that psychiatry works in opposition to both liberty and responsibility. Szasz reveals that psychiatric slavery, in other words, quote, confining individuals in madhouses, unquote, began in the 17th century, but did not become pervasively accepted social custom until the 19th century. The bottom line of the psychiatric balance sheet, Szasz argued, is fixed. Why? Szasz continues. Individuals deemed insane are incarcerated because they are mentally ill and dangerous to themselves and others. For more than 40 years, I have maintained that psychiatric reforms are exercises in prettifying plantations. Slavery cannot be reformed, it can only be abolished. So long as the idea of mental illness imparts legitimacy to the exercise of psychiatric power, psychiatric slavery cannot be abolished. I want to emphasize that last sentence. So long as the idea of mental illness imparts legitimacy to the exercise of psychiatric power, psychiatric slavery cannot be abolished. So that's the main thing, because that's what the myth of mental illness does. It was created to lend legitimacy to the exercise. It was made to justify psychiatric coercion. So as long as that myth remains obscured, as long as people believe that myth, then it will continue to justify psychiatric coercion and psychiatric slavery. That's why Szasz's book, The Myth of Mental Illness, is so important to understand, because once that myth is exposed for what it is, the truth about it, or why I'm doing these videos, the truth about psychiatry, that will show the illegitimacy of psychiatry as a profession, and especially as a medical profession, and that way the abolition of psychiatry can be a peaceful abolition and one of, where the institution crumbles on its own without the need for any violent opposition, which I don't advocate for violence. So then I have a whole list of quotations from this book. A lot of good stuff in there. Maybe I'll review that at the beginning of the next session. But this has been a good introduction, I think, to Szasz on liberation by oppression and psychiatric slavery, and the idea and just to reveal what is going on with psychiatry, why there are people who are anti-psychiatry, why there are modern abolitionists of psychiatry. So, and there's so many more books by Szasz to talk about in the future, but those are just a few things to chew on. If you have any questions or comments, please keep them civil and feel free to share them below. I'll share links to my blog posts below, and I will see you soon.